This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about you.
Hello and welcome into episode 136 of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. So one thing I do pretty often when I'm away from the office is I watch a lot of movies, especially during Oscar season. I like to find every nominee I can, rank them, talk about what I liked, what I didn't. And one thing, when you watch a lot of movies, you understand that there's a lot of familiar characters and a lot of predictable outcomes in storytelling. So when one is unpredictable, when it gives you something new, it stands out. And that's very similar when it comes to the world of used oil analysis. We deal with narratives all the time. We follow trends. We see predictable outcomes when contamination enters the mix. And when problems go unchecked, we see the predictable outcome. Failure, lots of metal, oil that looks horrible in testing as a result. But nevertheless, we want to celebrate when we see something that's different, that really stands out in a good way. That's what this episode is all about, is a pleasant surprise, one that wasn't surprising just to me, the analyst who was looking at the sample, but one that when I presented the context first, not the results, to my fellow analysts, almost no one could predict what vehicle this sample came from, given the notes, the details surrounding the sample in question. Now, there was one analyst that did manage to predict exactly what was going on, but overall, there was a lot of surprise in these results, how they came to be. So I wanted to talk about this vehicle's story because it's one that just we don't see very often. Let me start at the beginning, which is when any analyst sits down to work on a report, we're simply taking lab numbers to work on, lab numbers that have been assigned to samples that have arrived in the mail. We take a certain amount, depending on the situation, of lab numbers to work on. Next, we load the data. And when we're loading the data, we can see the numbers, just, the raw data, but free of any details at that point. After you've been doing this a while, you kind of get a pretty good idea what stories you're going to run into in terms of who the players are. Like a turbine oil is going to look like a turbine oil. There's really no mistaking it. An unused oil sample, pretty easy to spot. Obviously, elements that show contamination. Well, regardless of what vehicle it came from, we know we're probably going to be talking about those elements. So we can kind of get this broad stroke idea of what we're running into when we just pull up the raw data. But seemingly ordinary numbers can take on a whole life of their own when we find out the context surrounding those numbers. So in this case, I was looking at data that to me looked like a pretty typical wear-in situation. We saw metals like copper leading the pack, followed by aluminum, then iron, and for a lot of gasoline engines, when they mature or when they don't have a problem or, it's just a normal context where there's no contaminants and it's a mature engine, generally you'll see a metal like iron be dominant because most of the components in a engine are going to be made of steel. So this was a pretty typical wear-in situation at a glance because not only were metals speaking to that, but also the silicon level was a little high in general. And when you have sealers and lubes washing out, that tends to be the case. Now, of course, you can have silicon from dirt too, but in general, the shape of metals, the lineup, how they looked, I felt like I was probably going to be looking at a pretty typical wear-in situation. And that couldn't have been further from the case. So now I'll dive into the notes here surrounding the sample. Still not going to talk about the car just yet, but here's the notes the customer was kind enough to include on their oil information slip. Shout out to them. Always encourage anyone who is sending in a sample to just give a brief summary of what's going on. Even if everything is normal on your end, that's okay to say too. Like just say, nothing unusual, routine oil change. Even a note as simple as that does a great deal to help us help you as far as delivering maybe just the analysis that is most meaningful to whatever maintenance situation you're dealing with. Obviously, if you're suspecting a problem, we want to key on that. We want to directly address, maybe what you think couldn't speak to a problem, or, you might have an idea of what a certain metal might indicate. And even if you're a little off base there, or if you just have a curiosity about what could or couldn't show a problem, it's always helpful to know what you're interested in when we're crafting the comment. It helps us ensure that you're getting the most out of a report. And here are the notes the customer included with the sample that we're focusing on today. Quote, I did not really do a good break-in period. I redlined at least 10 times before 600 miles. After first oil change, started going ham in all caps. I changed this oil to 540 since I'm tuning the car to 310 horsepower. I almost always use Shell 93, sometimes Quick Trip 93. Now, point of clarification for those that don't know, this happens to apply directly to when I was in school. To say that you are going ham means that you're going hard as a... And if you've never heard ham used that way, then, well, you've already learned something today. But those notes surrounding a wear-in sample, that's already kind of unusual. I mean, typically people really want to baby cars quite a bit early on, but not always. And that's just one mild aspect of what made this sample so interesting, what made it really stand out. So often people are not going to be this demanding early on. But the vehicle make and model is just not one that I anticipated being subject to this particular break-in strategy, much less one that's, redlining on a regular basis. So I went around and I messaged our analysts on staff. I just wanted to see if they could guess the vehicle make and model based on all of these factors. I mean, again, we're talking about a motor that is young, just getting started, and redlining at least 10 times before 600 miles, adding horsepower, all the things that could be involved with going ham on this person's end. And one analyst got it. Like I mentioned earlier, they predicted the car. And here it is. A brand new Hyundai Elantra sporting a 2.0 liter turbo under the hood. Now, granted, a turbocharged motor, a lot of those tend to experience some harder use, as they should. If you're buying a vehicle with a turbo, you should see what it can do. But I was still taken aback, and not in a bad way at all. Like, this is not judging anyone's, maintenance strategy or how they take care of their car. It's just rare. I mean, this isn't quite the time where I stumbled upon a minivan that was being used for racing, but it still stands out. And I bring it up just to say that after looking at the results, maybe more people should be redlining their Hyundai. I don't know, because the results were fantastic. Now, like I mentioned up at the top, there were some traditional hallmarks of wear-in, a little more aluminum and copper than average, but honestly, nothing crazy. So to give you an idea of what's typical for this engine type in general, remember our averages are based on engines that are, a bit more mature. So typically there's not going to be a lot of break-in samples added to that average file. So on average, we'll typically see aluminum and copper at 4 ppm. That's part per million. And in this sample, we had aluminum at 8, copper at 10. But this is very close to wear-in. Again, it's the second oil change. Looks like silicon is already well within the average range. So typically we'll see like 17. This one had 22. Some of that probably is still sealer as well. Oils that don't use silicon typically can be below 10 to start. So, still a bit high, but whatever is extra there is just going to be sealer in all likelihood. And metals are just barely high enough to mark, really. Better yet, this was an oil run that was already beyond the average interval. Our averages for the engine type are based on about 4,700 miles. This oil had 5,291. And in the context of a motor still not far removed from wear-in, this would be pretty standard for like a grocery getter, just someone going point A to point B. Because even after digging into the average file a bit more, I just wanted to see, what some of these motors were looking like to start off. Pretty good. I mean, I saw samples with more metal, fewer miles, no mention. Now, who knows? Maybe they too were going ham in all manner of ways and just didn't tell us. But that's all to say, this engine looks very good in general. And these are levels that we would expect to improve a bit as it matures. As for the oil itself, didn't look too shabby either. Viscosity was a little thin, but not related to fuel dilution. Strong TBN, so there was a lot of active additive to spare. Really good. The oil filter kept insolubles quite low as well, so not a lot of oxidation happening, at least not any more than the oil filter would have been able to keep in check. Altogether, it's a vehicle with a very promising story so far. One that I can't wait to see where it goes. Nothing predictable here about the results because sure, like these engines don't make a lot of metal in general. They're pretty good. But when you factor in how demanding the use was, the context surrounding the sample, it just makes for a very promising story with a surprising character at the center. And that's something that we really appreciate as analysts, because after looking at thousands and thousands of samples in my time, you just see a lot of familiar stories. The antagonist as the harmful contaminant, the protagonist, which is hopefully you, taking care and trying to defeat, all the things that can cause or wreak havoc under the hood. Just in the line of duty, you'll see a lot more metal than this and, issues that owners have to tackle. But here, it looks like an engine that just happens to be among the best from a wear standpoint. We are going to look for some improvement, hopefully. And I say that just because even when harder use is a factor, there's still likely to be some wear in metal that hasn't cleared up yet in the first few oil changes. So we'll be intrigued to see how things trend. If the levels end up being stable, not the worst outcome. I mean, it's a little more metal than average, but certainly not this buildup that would be wreaking havoc in terms of causing the oil to lose its ability to clean and lubricate. So nothing along those lines. I just anticipate some progress due to the fact it normally takes a few oil runs before wear-in is gone. However, starting out, it's a promising story and can't wait to see where it goes from here. So maybe over the course of hearing this episode, you might think that you're asking the same of your engine and you're wondering how it's responding. Or maybe you're concerned about just the engine going about its daily life and you want to help it stay on the road as long as possible. Well, analysis is the way to go. Sampling the engine oil is a non-invasive procedure. It tells you what's going on in the crankcase. And who knows, your engine might have a story worth telling. If you need to learn more, just head to blackstone-labs.com. And that brings today's show to a close. Thank you so much for hanging with me. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.